So if you're telling a story of another client of yours that happens to be very similar to the client you're trying to get, then you're not pushing out information, you're pulling them in. It literally makes you magnetic and memorable, because most people forget the facts after you've finished, but a good story stays with you.
Allan has started and grown several multi-million-dollar businesses. His mission is to help you do the same. Welcome to the Business Growth Pod, building the future one entrepreneur at a time.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Business Growth Pod. I'm your host, Allan Draper. Thank you so much for joining me today. Make sure to go to my website, allandraper.com, and schedule an appointment. I am looking for new angel investment opportunities, as I always am. If you have a business that you need some help with, you're looking for some financing, make sure to reach out to me there. I am very excited about our show today. So here's the question. What makes a sales pitch successful? Oftentimes it comes down to connectivity. The seller connecting with the prospective customer, client, whatever. Pre-existing relationships can definitely help with this, but so can the ability to tell a really good story. John Livesay is known for the latter. John turned an award-winning career at Condé Nast into a successful career as a sales consultant focused on storytelling, a move whose highlights include a TED Talk, best-selling book, being featured in the Larry King Show, and the name The Pitch Whisperer. So glad that you could make it. Thanks for joining me today, John.
Great to be with you. I love all your kicks back there. You're a big shoe guy, I see.
Yeah. I grew up in the 90s, and Michael Jordan was kind of a big thing back then, still is. And the funny thing about my shoes is that I could never really afford them as a kid. And so all the ones that you see, and for the people that are listening to this versus watching it on YouTube, in my studio, I have some Jordans behind me, the sneakers, but I don't wear any of those. They just sit there. I have over 100 pairs that I just have. I wear probably 10 or so, but yeah.
It's like art for you. Well, talk about good stories. Did you see the movie with Viola Davis playing his mother? And
I did.
Yeah. So that was riveting in terms of unprecedented and convincing him to sign with Nike when Nike wasn't Nike.
Yeah, incredible story, especially the part where, if you remember, where she's kind of holding firm. This is Michael Jordan's mom is holding firm to him getting not just kind of this contract deal, like this upfront money or guaranteed money, but a percentage of sales.
Yeah.
Which fast forward to 2023, he makes, I think it's like several $100 million a year from the sales of the shoes. So it continues to today. So very interesting story. And behind me is a book by Phil Knight. It's kind of his autobiography called Shoe Dog. And I thought the movie was going to be more like the book. It has parts, but delves more directly into the deal with Michael Jordan. But I highly recommend that book. It's very entertaining, talks a lot about sports, talks a lot about Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Tiger Woods. And it's very motivational from a business standpoint, as Phil Knight's incredible business person. So yeah, kind of interesting that you mentioned that. So you've kind of garnered this name, The Pitch Whisperer. Tell me about that. What is it that makes you the man when it comes to a sales pitch?
Well, a couple of years ago, Anthem Insurance was interviewing me and two other speakers to be at their sales kickoff meeting. And they were asking me if I'd done a lot of other healthcare events and other things like that. And instead of just directly answering them with a yes or no or the answers, I said, well, I'm happy to answer that, but I have one question for you. What's going to happen if I'm the selected speaker after my keynote? And they said, oh, well, we're going to have an improvisation session and people are going to shout out objections and role play on stage. And I said, well, what if I stayed after my talk and would whisper in people's ear something from the talk to keep the conversation going? Because as you probably know, improvisation is all about yes and And they said, oh my gosh, we never thought to even ask, and no one's offered, you're hired. So that went really well. And I would whisper in people's ears, and they said, gosh, I wish you could be in my ear when I'm out in the field. And I told this story to Inc. magazine, and they said, sounds like you're the pitch whisperer. And I love that so much. I've trademarked it. And if you Google that, all my content shows up. And that's the story behind how that happened.
That's incredible. And I mean, it's an interesting story, right, of how you got that nickname, but it's very cool the way that you won that gig, the way that you know what I mean? Because you turned it on them a little bit. They asked you a question and you asked them something.
Yes.
Added value, added creativity. So then it was an easy decision for them.
Exactly. And I talk about how to go from invisible to irresistible in business. I have a ladder with different rungs on it. And in the middle is interesting, where you're just sort of stuck in the friend zone at work, where people say, I'm interested, but you never get them to pull the trigger. And so I'm constantly working with people on what story can you tell to get out of that friend zone at work and become the irresistible choice.
So let's talk about that. There's something about a story that just draws people in. Mm-hmm. Stories, when there's a public speaker, there's, somebody at a community event, a workshop, whatever, even speaking to within your organization in a company that you own. Mm-hmm. There's something about leading with a story and kind of making parallels back to that story to draw a point that's not only interesting and kind of riveting, but it also helps folks remember the point that you're talking about. What is it? Why is it that we're programmed that way? Why is a story so compelling?
Well, Allan, the reason why a story is so compelling is that we are literally wired for storytelling. Back when we all lived in caves, people told stories by fireplaces and drew pictures on the wall. And now we sit around the glow of PowerPoint presentations at big corporate events. But it's that sense of a different part of our brain is engaged. If I start pushing out a bunch of facts and data, you go into analysis, which usually results in analysis paralysis. You've got too much to decide and decipher. But if I start telling you a story, you're the right side where emotions and feelings and all that live, the emotional connection that is so important. And your brain relaxes a little bit. It doesn't get into this analysis mode of defensive, oh, I can't, or, I'm not sure what the right answer is. You're going to tell me a story. Maybe it'll even be a little entertaining. We're going on a journey. And if there's messaging within the story, and one of the secrets that I teach people is how to tell a story so that other people see themselves in the story. So if you're telling a story of another client of yours that happens to be very similar to the client you're trying to get, then you're not pushing out information, you're pulling them in. It literally makes you magnetic and memorable, because most people forget the facts after you've finished, but a good story stays with you.
What's interesting is there's this book, Donald Miller, if I'm remembering correctly, Building a Story Brand or something like that.
Exactly.
And he talks about one of the biggest marketing concerns that companies have is they try to set themselves up as the hero. When in reality, the hero is the client, customer, whatever. And it's just what you just said. When you're speaking, the most intriguing stories are the ones where people identify truths in themselves or correlations in themselves within that story, because we're, self-interested creatures, right? We are. It's a survival mechanism, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with that. And so how do we serve our best interests is by helping others do the same.
Well, unlike what Donald does, which is fantastic, helping brands, I help salespeople create stories. Instead of a case study, I turn that into a case story, and it really comes into play when they're up against competitors, because there's so many industries, architecture, law, tech, healthcare, that they fill out a proposal, they're in the final three, everybody gets an hour to come in and present, pitch, whatever you want to call it. And that's really where whoever tells the best story is the one that's going to be memorable. Because if you've told a case story instead of a case study, that somebody can remember and repeat, they become your brand ambassador for the meeting after the meeting. And what do I mean by the meeting after the meeting? They hear all the pitches, then they have a second meeting and say, well, we heard from 3 different vendors. What do you think? And unfortunately, most of them will say, well, they all sounded alike, whether it's a real estate agent or an insurance agent or a tech company. I guess we should go with the cheapest price. But if you've told a story that sounds just like their situation of another client that you helped and you're the Sherpa helping them climb Mount Everest, or Yoda in Star Wars helping them navigate all these things, then they want to go on the journey with you, because the better you explain someone's problem in your story, the more they think you have their solution. And that's where empathy comes in.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, that you have to understand their position in order to connect with them through a story. How, when you're, I own a digital marketing company. It's called Lizard SEM. And we're only a few years old. We were bidding on this website build for $1 billion company. It was I was surprised we were even considered, to offer a bid. And one of the issues was that we didn't understand them enough and what they were looking for. How does somebody start in that research phase where they can show that empathy, they can show that they really understand, and they're able to connect through a story?
Well, let me give you a story of Honeywell. They engaged me to be a sales keynote speaker, and they were selling fans in the operating room. And so one of the questions that I asked, because they were telling it in terms of particles and data and how fast the fans was spinning, and nothing that was emotional, and certainly no story. And they were sort of stuck as a commodity purchasing people. So I said, let's create the story so that the stakes are high enough that we care. And the question that I ask, that anyone can ask in business, is what happens if this doesn't work? And so I said that about the fan. In your particular case, imagine if you had said to them, what happens if your website design isn't good, or the SEO isn't there, or or there's mistakes, or it crashes, or whatever you offer that makes it so vital. We lose business, people don't come back, we have all those brand things. But in the case of the fan, they said, well, they're operating on a patient, the room needs to be clean, or the patient could get infected. Great. Okay, that's a good problem to solve. And then I simply said 2 additional words that now you, Allan, and everyone watching and listening can have in their toolbox when you're trying to find out what else is going on that other people may not know. Anything else? 2 words. And in this case, you're turning it on yourself. Is there anything else that you're solving here besides the obvious, keeping the patients healthy? And this is pre-COVID. And they said, well, now that you mention it, doctors and nurses are in surgery after surgery, cutting people open with these lasers that create smoke. And if the fan's not working, they could get secondhand smoke damage. I said, now we have a story. This is a fan that keeps the staff at the hospital healthy. You're not going to talk just to purchasing. You're going to HR with this, because this can become a recruiting tool for human resources to get the best doctors and nurses to want to work here, that we have invested in your safety. And you're no longer a commodity. This is a tool that helping us get top talent, and you've separated yourself from everybody else.
That's incredible. I mean, and just to a layperson, not a physician or involved in the medical industry, that resonates, right? What you're doing is aligning interests. You're showing value to the people that are making the decision, and in a way, it's really cool because you're helping them solve problems that they probably didn't even know they had, or were thinking about. Like, hey, you're going to be able to, because if you brought something to me and it was like this, tangential product that didn't really have anything to do with HR/recruiting, and you're like, oh, by the way, because it's going to make it safer for the physicians and for the nurses, and you're going to be able to use that and kind of separate, distinguish yourself in the marketplace from your competitors. That makes it a no-brainer.
Exactly.
Impressive. I love that. I know that you were at Condé Nast for a while. What did your time there teach you about the power of storytelling?
Uh, well, one of the clients I had was Jaguar in Southern California when I was based there. And they said, we looked at 50 different brands, magazine, publications, websites. We've narrowed it down to 10. You each get 30 minutes to come in and tell us why we should pick you. Do not talk about numbers. We've already analyzed that. That's why you're in the final 10. And by the way, we're only going to pick 3 brands. So you're in the final 10, but you're competing for one of 3 slots. And half of the reps were deer in headlights. Don't talk about numbers. I don't know what to talk about. And that was my light bulb moment. And I said, whoever tells the best story is the one that's going to get the sale. And so with Jaguar, their challenge was they wanted to be seen as moving sculpture, as well as be part of the conversation when people were talking about luxury things like art. But they didn't know how to do either. So the idea we came up with in the presentation was, and this is with the marketing department's brainstorm, but it was my job as a salesperson to sell this idea to go along with the ads. We are able to identify 10 couples, zip codes that are near a dealer who have a competitive car, whether it's a Mercedes or BMW, lease expiring in 6 months, your ideal target. And we're going to have Jaguars pick those 10 couples up and take them to our Golden Globes party. And then from there, they'll be taken to a private dinner at a private room with a chef at a restaurant. And someone from the Museum of Modern Art will be in that private dining room talking about art with a Jaguar representative. And in between courses, you can take another test drive of another model besides the one you arrived in. Well, they sold 3 cars that night, including one to the chef. And I got $500,000 worth of advertising. And that is how telling that story at Condé Nast has allowed me to teach other people how to tell stories that make people want to work with you versus all the other choices they have out there.
That's incredible. So at some point you decide to leave Condé Nast and go out on your own. What motivated your decision to do that?
Well, my speaking career started when I was at Condé Nast. I was able to write my first book on selling while I was still employed there. And luckily, the publisher of the magazine, W at the time, had launched Oprah's magazine. So Alice Alston was incredibly supportive, threw a book party for me, both in LA and New York. And we would say to the advertisers like Jaguar, we'll give you a copy of my book to give your salespeople. And I will come speak to your sales team on how to sell to the luxury market as part of the added value program. And that really made me realize, oh, I love speaking to sales teams. I've been in their shoes. I am in their shoes. And then I started getting requests beyond just our advertisers' sales teams to do it. And that's what made me decide this is what my next step in my career is going to be.
That's awesome. So generally speaking, if I made you pin down one key to a good story, what would that be?
The resolution. In other words, the story has 4 parts. The exposition, you paint a picture, who, what, where, when. You describe a problem, you have a solution, and then the resolution. What is life like after you've bought that product or service? I think of The Wizard of Oz. If The Wizard of Oz ended with Dorothy getting in the balloon to go back to Kansas, the end, that would not be as great a movie as it is. But no, there's that resolution scene where she's going, oh my God, you were there, and there's no place like home, and I appreciate everything. Most stories don't have a resolution. So let me give you an example of one. Olympus, the camera company, brought me in to speak to their sales team, and they have a product. They said it makes the surgeries go 30% faster. We're telling that fact to doctors, but we're not getting a lot of response. It's so logical. We don't understand why. So, well, people buy emotionally and then back it up with logic. So we crafted this case story. Imagine how happy Dr. Higgins was 6 months ago down at Long Beach Memorial using our equipment when he could go out to the patient's family in the waiting room an hour earlier than expected. And if you've ever waited for someone you love to come out of the surgery, you know every minute feels like an hour. The doctor comes out and says, good news, the scope shows they don't have cancer, they're going to be fine. Then turned to the rep and said, this is why I became a doctor, for moments like this. Now the rep tells that case story to another doctor at another hospital who sees himself in the story. And 9 times out of 10, that doctor says, that's why I became a doctor. I want your equipment too. So the exposition, we know the doctor's name. We know how long ago. We know the problem is the stakes are high and I pull you in by saying, if you've ever had to wait for someone you love, and even if you haven't, you could probably imagine how painful that would be.
Yeah.
And then the solution is that if the story just ended with the doctor saying the scope shows they're fine, that's okay, but it's not great. The resolution in that story is the doctor saying, this is why I became a doctor, for moments like this. And that's what hooks other people to see themselves in that story.
Yeah, I think if you paint that picture and get them to see, themselves in the story, and then whatever the resolution is, or whatever the goal being achieved is, that makes it a really easy decision for them. And as you're talking, John, it reminds me so much of Simon Sinek and his philosophies of how our greatest motivator needs to be why we do something, not necessarily what. And and he has famous TED Talk called The Golden Circle, where he talks about the Wright brothers and Martin Luther King and Apple. And he talks about this concept of, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but he says something about, if people are behind what you do, they'll work for your dollars, right? They'll work for a paycheck. But if they're behind why you do it, they'll work for you with their blood, sweat, and tears.
That's why I say good leaders are good storytellers. You need to tell a story of what your vision is to get everyone to want to work with you, let alone investors you're pitching or clients you're pitching. So it's all about the stories that pull people in. And I had someone say to me, you're kind of like a male Brene Brown. You talk about empathy, and she does too. Or someone will say, we love Simon Sinek's talk, but as a company, we can't afford Simon, so we picked you. And I said, listen, I am honored to be in the same realm as Simon or Brene Brown, and I present a more affordable alternative as a sales keynote speaker to a company that doesn't have the budget for either of those two superstars. So knowing who you are like, but having enough of your own unique intellectual property and content that you're not just repeating what they say, but you put your own spin on it. In my case, this is really targeted to salespeople versus branding people. That's been a great niche for me, because you want to not have to reinvent everything from scratch, but put your own, the mousetrap just 10% different or better in a new way that makes it sticky.
Do you find that there are certain personality types or certain individuals involved in sales that kind of get behind what you're saying, get behind this idea of selling with a story, having kind of this higher purpose? Is there a personality match there? And do you ever struggle with certain individuals where they just have a tough time understanding it, and they're more about dollars and cents and the numbers like you mentioned before?
Right. Well, ironically, I specialize in tech and healthcare audiences, and a lot of them are very left brain. They love the numbers. They love the data. And it's not that they're resistant, but that they just don't think like that. And so I've been asking them to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and stretch. I had a CEO of a recruiting firm that competes with Korn Ferry to get big companies to use them to find their CEOs and CFOs and all that. And he said, we compete against other recruitment firms, and we hope we get to go last, because we think whoever goes last is memorable. And I said, well, that's not a good strategy, hoping you get to go last. And he said, can you just explain to me how storytelling helps us sell better? And I said, well, let me give you an example of another client who I helped tell a story that helped them win $1 billion airport renovation. They're an architecture firm. And they, had to convince that Pittsburgh airport to hire them versus the other two firms. And so I told him that story, and he went, light bulb. Even if we go first and we tell the best story, we'll be memorable. We're no longer dependent on having to go last to be memorable. And so once people start to have a conversation with me and hear the examples of case stories winning big accounts, then they're willing to say, okay, we need this. It's something we don't have. This will be our secret weapon. We're going to get our soft skills to be as good as our hard skills. That awareness, the soft skills of storytelling, listening, empathy will match your hard skills, whether you're a doctor, lawyer, architect, recruiter, whatever.
What's interesting is I'm reading this book called Deep Work, and it's just totally changing my perspective on focus and the ability to retain your attention and all these things. There's this section in the book that's talking about memory. And there's this story of this individual, I believe he was in Australia, and they call it like mental athletics or something, where they have to remember certain things. And he says that it's actually not very difficult for even the average person to memorize a deck of 52 cards in 5 minutes or less. And then the author goes through this process of explaining how to do it, how these mental athletes do it. And the interesting thing, John, is that they use a story.
Yes.
So the way that they do it is they choose 5 rooms in a house, and they think of 10 things in each room. They associate each of those 10 cards to that room, and they imagine themselves going into the room, looking at, the chair that's in there, the desk that's in there, whatever, then going to the next room. And studies have shown that this is the best way, not just, I think they call it rote memorization, where it's just repeating over and over and over again, right? But it's creating this mental imagery that really sticks with people. And I think that's exactly what you're saying, is that if you use a story, that in and of itself is going to make a longer lasting impression than not.
Well, I agree with you 100%. In fact, I tell people, here's a checklist to make sure your story is working. Is it clear or confusing? Is it concise so that people can remember and repeat it? And is it compelling? They have to feel something. Clear, concise, and compelling. And when you tell a story to somebody, ask them those 3 questions, and that allows you to keep refining it till it's as good as it can be. But the conciseness helps make it memorable, especially when someone's listening. You want them to repeat that to be your inside champion brand ambassador.
John, I think we can all benefit from using more stories. We can benefit in our relationships with our kids or our loved ones, helping, I know that if I tell my kids a story, they're going to resonate with that more than if I'm just giving them a lecture.
Oh, yeah. Every kid wants to hear the story of how their parents met or the day they were born, right? It's just part of our DNA.
100%. And this applies to our businesses. This applies to, anything that we want to make an impact with. And I love you that you're able to come on here, share this information with us, your passion for storytelling and the sales process. This has been fantastic. Where can people go if they want to learn more about you, get additional information about how they can improve their sales processes through storytelling?
My name, johnlivesay.com, L-I-V as in Victor, E-S-A-Y. My book is called The Sale is in the Tale. It's a business fable set in Austin. So it's a story about storytelling. If you can't remember any of that, just Google The Pitch Whisperer and all my content will show up there.
Love it. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, John. I look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Thanks, Allan.
If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave us a rating. And for daily inspiration and business tips, follow Allan on Instagram. Until next time, remember, we build the future one entrepreneur at a time.